Hi everyone, Stephen Van Tassel here, wildlife control consultant, giving you another episode of Living the Wildlife podcast as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Welcome aboard, glad to have you. Thank you for subscribing to the show and some of the support that I've received. So I certainly appreciate that and hope that these podcasts are going to be beneficial for you in terms of making money, saving money, and improving your quality of life and the life of your clients that you're serving. Of course, we welcome non-wildlife control operators to tag along as well. And of course, your pest control operators, the more the merrier. So if you're not familiar with the Living the Wildlife podcast, I handle the vertebrate side of things. So I don't really do much in the area of bugs, learning about bugs, but I'm primarily a vertebrate pest specialist. What does that all mean? It means I work with animals that have a spine. Insects don't have a spine. Raccoons, skunks, squirrels, pocket gophers, moles, all have a spine. That's sort of my world. So we kind of have some specializations within the pest control field. I deal with vertebrates, and that's my role here in the Pest Geek podcast. Do subscribe. And we need your support, and give us a review. We'd appreciate that as well. No sponsors for this particular episode, so we are still available. If you're interested in sponsoring our show, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. And of course, if you're interested in being a guest on our show, definitely reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, and we can talk about making that happen. All right. What are we talking about in terms of this particular episode? We are going to talk about what is the best raccoon bait. Now, you may have your own ideas about what that means. And all of those could be valid in your particular area, maybe. But the problem is a lot of that stuff is what we call anecdotal evidence. What is anecdotal evidence? Anecdotal evidence is basically you talk to someone and they say, yeah, I think this is going to be the best bait. That's anecdotal evidence. Same way with your own experience. You may say, hey, I tried this and it worked really well. I think this is the best bait. Anecdotal information. Now, what's the difference between anecdotal information and research-based information? Well, anecdotal information is basically where there hasn't been a careful study done and there's been really no valid record keeping taking place. So can some anecdotal information be from record keeping? Sure. Some wildlife control operators keep really good records about the types of baits they're using, weather conditions, locations, and all that. And so that can be fairly reliable if there's a high enough data set. But when we're looking at research-based information, that means the researcher has created a study design where different baits have an equal chance of being selected. And there's enough sample size to see if there's any significant difference over time. And so that's what I'm talking about. What is the research-based information on finding the best raccoon bait? Well, is this particular product that I'm going to talk about going to be the best raccoon bait? I don't know. But the point is that this information comes from researchers who have had a chance to trial different products, and what I'm hoping that you get out of it is that it expands your database of baits that you can use, because this is something that most homeowners are not going to be trying. We've probably all heard of that cat food in oil or sardines in oil. After a while, some of that gets a bit old. You may need to change things up, and it's always a good idea to have a list of baits available, because you may find that your go-to bait for a very long period of time was really hammering the raccoons, and then all of a sudden, boop, it stopped working. And who knows why? It could be a variety of reasons, but the point is you need to get a change up. And so I hope this is going to help expand your database in thinking about baits. So what is the difference between a bait and a lure? Well, a bait is something typically solid that the animal's going to eat. Okay, where a lure tends to be more odor-based, where the animal's sensing it in terms of a smell and may want to taste it, but it's attracted to that liquid. So lures can be anywhere from, they can be from sex glands, they can be food-based, they can be curiosity, where it's just a strange odor. Baits, by and large, tend to be something edible and something food-based where the animal wants to eat it. Now, the bait may be bitter where the animal doesn't want to eat it, but the point is the animal wants to try to eat it and it may find it has a bad experience. Always check up on your baits with your bait manufacturer to see if this is a bitter tasting bait, because you have to distinguish between a fur trapping approach to baiting and a cage trapping approach to baiting. Fur trappers only need to have the animal approach the bait to get caught in the foothold or the conibear, where in a cage trap, the animal has to kind of go commit all the way in before it begins to hit that treadle. And so it's a much different scenario. And plus, if you use bait at the beginning of your cage or your box trap and it's bitter, the animal may not come all the rest of the way in. So definitely keep that in mind. All right, so what is the best raccoon bait? Well, let's talk about what this research was from. So I was reading an article. We're looking over an article and read it word for word. Kind of scan some things. This is by William F. Andelt and Timothy P. Woolley. They published an article entitled, get this title now, Responses of Urban Mammals to Odor Attractants in a Bait Dispensing Device. All right, so there's a lot going on there. So they were basically testing some attractants that would be useful for urban mammals to see which one they thought would work the best. This was published in the Wildlife Society Bulletin, 1996. Volume 24, Issue 1, pages 111 through 118. So this is not my research. I'm not trying to tell you that, oh, Stephen's the great guru on baits. That's not what I'm saying. I'm simply kind of relating a summary of the information contained in this particular journal article that may be useful for you. Now, not all journal articles or not all articles are the same. So let's talk a little bit about the hierarchy of information. Okay, so we talked about anecdotal information, right? This is where personal experience comes in. It can be valid. It can be important. I'm not saying you trash it, but it doesn't have the same kind of weight as sort of a trade magazine article. Trade magazines would be like Pest Control Technology Magazine, Pest Management Professional Magazine. Those are trade magazines. And then you have peer-edited documents like the Vertebrate Pest Conference publication. You also have the Wildlife Damage Management Conference proceedings. Those would be peer-edited documents. And then at the highest level, you have what's called peer-reviewed journal articles. This is what the Wildlife Society Bulletin is. It's a peer-reviewed journal article, so it's the top level of information. Does it mean it's always perfectly true? No, it just means that it has been rigorously reviewed, and so it meets the scientific criterion. So this is what we call experimental science. So these folks went out and made a test. So how did they go about doing this? Well, the study took place in Fort Collins, Colorado. And Fort Collins is at an elevation of about 1,470 meters in height. So you're looking at probably 1,500 yards, maybe 1,550 yards. And they did this study in the latter parts of the 1980s. Okay, so there's 1988, 1989, and 1991. And the time of year they did it was April to May in 1988, 1989. And in August 1991. So they didn't do a full year. They didn't do all the seasons, all right? So definitely keep that in mind, because the question you have to ask yourself is, does the bait work better in some seasons versus other seasons, right? I mean, the ideal would be a bait that works perfectly year-round, right? But in terms of this particular research, the research was done in a very narrow window of time, spring, April to May, and then 1 year they did the study in August, which would be late summer. So definitely keep that in mind. So we're really talking about what is the best raccoon bait for the spring and summer. All right, so we can't talk about the winter. Raccoons would probably want to eat it, but we don't know. Okay, so we don't know. So what are the weather conditions in Fort Collins during this time of year? Well, the average temperature range goes between 48 degrees to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And the average rainfall during this period is somewhere, I've just lost my screen, so I got to ready. All right, there we go. And the average rainfall is 1.3 to 1.75 inches during this time. Relative humidity is low at 60 to 65%, so you can see why so many people want to live in Fort Collins, Colorado. It's a beautiful place. So what was their study design? How did they go about doing it? Well, what they did is they picked a spot around the city of Fort Collins, and then they basically created a large circle. You can even see sort of like pop filter here. So they picked a spot in the middle, and then from that middle went out to different locations and created some bait stations where they would create a circle 3 feet wide, and then sift the soil really fine, and then put the bait stick in the middle of that circle. This way they could tell whether there were footprints that came to it. Now, they didn't use this, and I'm not saying that they did, but it's sort of, I want to give you as an illustration of what they did. So basically they had a a bait holder at the top with a stake, and they pounded this into the ground. Now, how much bait did they use? 3 milliliters. So they didn't use a whole lot. They would stick this into the ground, and then they would come back each day and monitor. So they would put a bait in one, they'd go to the next bait station, put a bait in another, and they had to be sure they were far enough apart so that it wouldn't be the same animal interacting with all of them. Okay, and so then they did this over an extended period of time. So how far apart were the bait stations? Well, the closest scent station, they actually called them scent stations, was 875 yards. The farthest distance apart was 1,750 yards. Okay, so they were sifting this, and they basically tried. What lures did they trial? Well, great question. Here's what they did. They tested chicken eggs that were beaten and uncooked, because remember, they needed sort of a liquid consistency because they're only using 3 milliliters. All right. They used a product known as fatty acid scent. This is a lure ingredient that you can purchase from particular manufacturers. They also tried a commercial bait known as Haw Baker's Raccoon bait. Those of you with a fur trapping background should recognize Haw Baker's name. He's certainly a legend. Probably not as famous now, but certainly 20 years ago, a lot more people knew about him. They also tried cornmeal deep fried in corn oil. And then they tried Carmen's Coon Lure #1. And then they had water as a control. Now, why would they need a control? Well, because they want to make sure that animals aren't just being attracted to the bait station because of the sifted soil or because there's a liquid product there. So you always want to have a control in your bait. So why am I telling you this? Well, part of this, I want you to understand what the research design was for this particular research project, but also so that you as a professional can start taking better notes and that you can do your own trial. It won't have the same rigor as this particular study, but you can come up with some pretty good technical data. Now let me explain how you would do that. So if you're wanting to test which bait is going to be best, you're going to go to each property. If you're going to be targeting whatever animal you're targeting, and I would do it all with one species, keep all your species data tied together. And let's say you set 3 traps for a rat. You had a raccoon job and you set 3 traps. You need to have the traps positioned so they all have an equal chance of catching the raccoon, but you're going to put a different bait in each one, the same amount, and the same way. And then you're going to come back the next day and you're going to record which trap had any captures, if any, and you're going to keep that kind of record. You're going to do that consistently throughout the year. So you should have a very large data set of all the traps that you used and all the baits you used to try to catch a raccoon. I would stick with the same 3 throughout your study period. And you want to find out, if you have raccoons in all 3 of them, well, then you would put in your Excel spreadsheet, I'd make columns, bait 1, bait 2, bait 3, all were caught, and then have a location. If you're catching other animals, you need to include that information as well. And what you're looking for is, as you average everything up, and you can do this by trap night, okay, which is, one trap overnight is one trap night. So you'd have 3 trap nights, of course, but each bait has its own trap night. The idea being is that then at the end you would average up all of your captures in the 3 columns, and then you would look for the difference. How different was your catch rate between bait 1, bait 2, and bait 3? And if there's a significant difference, and there's ways to do that. You have to collect the data first. We could talk about how to do that later. But if there's a significant enough difference, then you would know one bait works better than all the rest. But you may find it may be 2 baits that are close together, and the third one's an outlier. Okay, so that's what they were doing here, except they were doing one particular bait each bait station, and so they were looking at the entire project overall and collecting this data in terms of they would go out and check looking for footprints, and then they would identify the animal on the basis of footprints. So let's go over those baits that they tested again. Chicken eggs that were beaten and uncooked, fatty acid scent, Hawbaker's raccoon bait, cornmeal that was deep fried in corn oil, Carmen's coon lure number 1, and of course water. And again, 3 milliliters of attractant was used at each station, so they weren't piling it on by any stretch of the imagination. All right, so let's get to the meat of the information. What were the results? Now, what throws it off a little bit is they didn't test all the baits each year. So Carmen's lure and the Hawbaker's lure were used in different years, so you can't necessarily compare them against each other because they were not used in the same year. But what they found was that the best bait to initiate visits and bites to the bait stick, okay, wasn't this, but I'm just using this as an illustration that they had the bait in the top and they would get a bite, was, believe it or not, cornmeal. Now, it wasn't this particular product, okay? When I'm not doing a spot, I'm just trying to show you cornmeal. This is mixed with flour, but they had cornmeal that was deep fried in corn oil, okay? Yes, that was number 1. Now, here's what I didn't put in my blog, okay? So those of you who are listening to the podcast here and watching the video are going to get information I did not include in my August 7th, 2020 blog. All right, so here it is. This information confirmed earlier research that was done for testing of baits that were going to be used to attract raccoons for a rabies vaccine study. You may recall hearing in the news out in the Ohio region area where they were dropping rabies vaccines to stop the spread of rabies from getting over the Appalachian Mountains. Well, they had to do research to figure out which bait formulation would be the most likely to be picked up by raccoons. And they tested at an earlier study, not this study, at an earlier study, they tested a wide variety of products because the products had to be both palatable and able to hold the capsule that contained the rabies vaccine. What they found back then was that cornmeal, deep fried in corn oil, was the number 1 bait. Now, several years later, here we have another study being done, and that, the Andelt study, the one I'm talking about here, they used cornmeal deep fried in corn oil, and that was number 1 for raccoons in this particular time. Now, some caveats to this particular study. The first year they did their work, raccoon presence was extraordinarily low. They think that was because of a distemper outbreak. So if you look at the raw numbers, and why do the raw numbers matter? Because when researchers are trying to find a significant effect, they want to have large data sets because more observations gives you a better chance of getting an accurate reading of how attractive something is, right? If I flip a coin and it comes up heads, am I going to say, well, every time I'm flipping a coin, it's going to come up heads? You'd realize it's silly. But if I did it 500 times and 450 times it came up heads, you'd probably be thinking that's significant. It would be, and also that I probably have a coin that's weighted a certain way, right? So it doesn't come up, because it should be coming up 50-50, right? It should be coming up half the time tails, half the time heads. But the point is that if I did 500 flips and 450 times it came up heads, you would say, wow, that's an amazing thing. Well, the same thing we want to do with our baits. If we have to have enough trials, enough opportunities to see if our information is an accurate reflection of reality. Because whenever we do scientific research, we only get a sliver of reality. But the bigger the slice of reality we have, the better likely we're going to be able to make induction. We're going to be able to make implications about future activity. Right? Because we're assuming that reality is stable and that the world isn't changing from moment to moment. Okay, so getting a little philosophical, getting a little geeky there, but that's why you want to have larger data sets. So doing one thing once and having success is not proof that that actually works, because you can get lucky, right? The proof is in how consistent is this information. So in that first year, they didn't have very good raccoon numbers, and they believe that was because they tied that to a distemper outbreak, which they said research shows kills 50% of the population of raccoons. However, following years, they did find the numbers went up somewhat, and they weren't staggering numbers. We're not talking about 100, they weren't in the hundreds by any stretch. But they did find that the cornmeal, deep fried in corn oil, was the number one bait. They did find that one challenge with this particular product, and that is it was also very attractive to squirrels. So if you are going to be using deep fried cornmeal and corn oil and try to use it to attract raccoons, understand that you may get a higher catch rate of squirrels as well, which certainly makes sense because squirrels like corn too. So it's something to definitely keep in the back of your mind. So what is my point here? Those of you who are bait manufacturers, you may be able to play with this and come up with a type of formulation that people can purchase and get the same results without having to worry about whether or not the cornmeal is going to rot. Because obviously if you're cooking this, deep frying it, how long does it last? I don't know. I haven't tried it yet. My point is that for these researchers, they didn't care because they probably made it relatively fresh, kept it in the freezer or whatever, I don't know, and they would try it out and use it. But for those of us who are working in the field, however, we're probably keeping it in a truck. We're not going to keep moving it back and forth from the truck to the freezer all the time, or have to go to the freezer to pull something out. I don't know, but this may be something where perhaps there's some preservative that would allow it to maintain its consistency and value without having to worry about it getting rotten. But it's something for us to think about, that cornmeal, deep fried, worked the best to capture raccoons. One more thing, don't forget, this occurred during the spring, so we're talking about April to May, and then another month was in August, so at that particular elevation. Give it a try. Check it out. I'd love to hear about what your thoughts would be about whether you think this research is confirmed with your experience. Cornmeal deep fried in corn oil, it doesn't hurt, doesn't improve your capture rate, or you catch too many squirrels and it just drives you nuts. That's something you're going to have to think about. So you can see, even when we look at scientific research, we still have to interpret it and apply it to our given situation. All right, that's it for me, Stephen Van Tassel, Wildlife Control Consultant. You can reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. That's wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear your comments, praise. Do subscribe to our channel. And, if you have criticisms, send those along too. And remember, this whole podcast is about living the wildlife. Why? Because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care.